there's no evidence for their illiteracy, and in fact considerable evidence against it. There are lots of cases of them writing letters, of Jesus reading, for example. That the early Christian movement was dominated by illiterates is simply unsupported in the sources. He also describes the Gospels as late. Because they're late, of course, they can't be trusted as history. But there are a lot of arguments for early dating for the sources for the Gospels. For example, it's generally agreed by New Testament scholars that the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts were written by the same author. So people routinely talk of Luke-Acts. Acts ends with Paul preaching in Rome for 2 years as a fulfillment of God's plan to bring the gospel to the Gentiles. But it doesn't mention the death of Paul, which is thought to have occurred sometime between AD 62 and 65. If Acts was written after the death of Paul, why did the author not mention that kind of important fact? Although various explanations have been suggested, the most obvious conclusion is that Acts was written before the death of Paul, that is in the early 60s. Since the Gospel of Luke was clearly written before Acts, this gives a date in the early 60s at the latest for the composition of the Gospel of Luke. Since it's widely agreed that Luke is dependent upon Mark, this gives a date from Mark in the late 50s at the latest. In fact, the main reason consistently given for dating the Gospels to after AD 70 is that Jesus prophesies of the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem. Since Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, and as atheists assure us, since there's no such thing as real prophecy, the Gospels must have been written after that destruction occurred, so in other words, after AD 70. But in fact, that's a very, very weak argument. We may be looking at documents that are written as early as within roughly 20 years of the death of Christ. Now, how does that compare to secular historiography from the ancient world? Hitchens seems to be under the impression that we're just awash in ancient documents that were written by eyewitnesses to many of the events that we talk about in ancient history. But listen to this. The earliest surviving biography of Alexander the Great by Diodorus dates to nearly 3 centuries after Alexander's death. Livy's account of the campaigns of Hannibal was written over a century and a half after the death of that general in 182 BC. Tacitus wrote his Annals about AD 115. His book covers imperial Roman history from AD 14 to 68, meaning that he wrote about 50 to 100 years after the events he describes. Suetonius wrote his history of the Caesars in the early 2nd century. His biography of Julius Caesar was thus written over a century and a half after the event. You get the point here? That by the standards of the ancient world, the Gospels are amazingly close, even if you give them a fairly late date. They're very, very close to the events they narrate. Herodotus wrote non-eyewitness accounts of the Persian War, and it was written up to half a century after the events he describes. Our major surviving source for the lives and teachings of most ancient philosophers is Diogenes Laertius, who wrote centuries after many of the men whose lives he records. Plutarch's famous biographies, Plutarch's Lives, are likewise often centuries after the fact. Hitchens clearly has no understanding of ancient historiography. If we were to go by his standards, we could know essentially nothing about the ancient world. All ancient history as it's taught, apart from the Gospels, secular ancient history would have to be tossed. Now, one of the things that's noteworthy about his approach is that he completely ignores Paul, who's our earliest surviving source for the life of Jesus. You can reconstruct a lot of the life of Jesus and the account of the resurrection and all those really important things from the letters of Paul. But Paul apparently wrote before the Gospels, probably the letters that are universally recognized as authentic in the 50s, again, early. We're talking about a gap of about 20 years between the death of Christ and the writing of Paul's letters. Let me go through a few miscellaneous errors here that I think are illustrative of, again, Hitchens' seriousness and how seriously he should be taken. One of my favorite is an epigraph that he has at the heading of one of his chapters. He's trying to show that all serious Christian thinkers are idiots. And so he has to take on one of the biggest, Thomas Aquinas, the greatest philosopher of the Middle Ages, certainly in the West. Thomas Aquinas is given a quote, it's placed in his mouth, "I am a man of one book." You know, the Bible, obviously. Now, I could not remember ever running across a quote like that from Thomas Aquinas, any passage that ever said that. In fact, anybody who's read Thomas Aquinas knows that he's constantly citing Aristotle, early Greek commentators on Aristotle, Avicenna, Arabic philosophers. He's drawing on all sorts of sources. He's a man of scores, if not hundreds of books. By the standards of the Middle Ages, this guy's a walking library. So why would he say, "I'm a man of one book"? Well, what a big surprise. He didn't. Hitchens says he said it, but he didn't. In fact, if you do a Google search for him, again, I'm trying to follow Hitchens' research methodology here. you come up with a quotation attributed to him, which is actually probably not authentic either, where he says, "Beware the man of one book." That's the opposite. I actually was so curious about this that I wrote to Ralph McInerney at Notre Dame. He's one of the leading Aquinas scholars in the world. And he wrote back and said, "Good grief, where'd that come from?" He says, just tell somebody to look at the notes in his texts. He's quoting all sorts of things. This is an outrageous misrepresentation of Aquinas. Another outrageous misrepresentation. He's trying to show that religion is evil in all its effects. So one example is Pius XII, the Pope during World War II, who he describes as a pro-Nazi Pope. Now, I will not get into this in any detail, but let me just say that's absurd. I know it's a common charge. It's absurd. The best book on it that I've seen is one written by Rabbi David Dallin, who's a professor of history back on the East Coast, called The Myth of Hitler's Pope. If anyone takes that seriously at all, have a look at this book. It's devastating to the claim. Here's one thing that Rabbi Dallin doesn't mention. I can sort of understand why, but I think this is significant. The chief rabbi of Rome, a fellow by the name of Israel Soli, at the end of World War II, said this: "What the Vatican did in terms of saving Jews will be indelibly and eternally engraved in our hearts. Priests and even high prelates did things that will forever be an honor to Catholicism." After the war, Soli became a Catholic. This is the chief rabbi of Rome. And to honor the Pope for what he had done for the Jews and for the role he had played in Soli's own conversion, he took the name of Eugenio, which was Eugenio Pacelli, Pope Pius XII's given name, in honor of the Pope and as gratitude for his baptismal name. Now, Hitchens, at this remove of time, can describe Pius XII as a pro-Nazi. The Nazis didn't feel that way. There's a new book out called, A Special Mission? A special mission about Hitler's plot to kidnap Pope Pius XII and execute him, which is what Hitler often did to his most faithful supporters, right? Now here's another tendency that you see running throughout Hitchens' book. Anything that's good is secular, anything that's bad is a believer, a faithful person. For example, he admires Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who died as a martyr against Hitler in 1945, just shortly before the end of World War II. Bonhoeffer was a pastor, a radical Christian who believed in a radical discipleship of Christ, and that led him into opposition to the Nazis. So Hitchens says that he wasn't really a believer, that he was motivated by a vague humanism. Karl Barth, who was another prominent opponent of Hitler, who is probably the most prominent Protestant theologian of the 20th century, is omitted altogether, even though he's the principal author of the principal Protestant statement denouncing Nazism. Okay? Because that doesn't count. That doesn't fit the narrative that he's trying to tell. Martin Luther King, whom he greatly admires, turns out not to have been a Christian at all. Now, that would have been a shock to King, who got a theology doctorate at Boston University, and whose speeches are just laden with biblical imagery. But no, he wasn't a believer either. Secularists, it turns out, were the ones who ended slavery. John Brown, you might have heard of him. John Brown was this militant Calvinist preacher who opposed slavery. It turns out he was a secularist too, according to Hitchens. There's no mention of William Wilberforce. Anyone see the recent movie called Amazing Grace, about William Wilberforce and the Christian opposition to slavery, the British slave trade? This was an evangelical movement led by Wilberforce and his friend John Newton, who wrote the hymn Amazing Grace. John Newton's not mentioned. William Wilberforce isn't mentioned. It turns out that slavery was done away with in the United Kingdom by secularists. There's no mention in his account of the end of slavery of the Underground Railroad. What's the significance of that? Or Sojourner Truth, or Harriet Tubman, or the Battle Hymn of the Republic, or Harriet Beecher Stowe. Remember the family we heard about from Terrell Givens yesterday, the Beechers. Great preacher family. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, the little lady who launched the war, right? No mention of them, because religious people can't ever do anything good. On the other hand, everything that's bad is done by religious people. For example, religious people put an end to science, tried to stop it out wherever they could. And of course he gets into the old standard warfare of science versus religion stuff. Now, I don't have time to expand on this, but merely to say that the latest interpretations of the history of science suggest that science grew up, interestingly enough, not in China, not in the Islamic world, not in India. Technologies did. Science grew up in Christian Europe. Why? Probably specifically because of attributes of Christian culture in Europe. Look at the works of Stanley Jackie or Pierre Duhem, other people who are writing on the subject of the history of science. This is pretty much the consensus view right now. But Hitchens doesn't know about it, or if he knows, he's not telling. Science and belief